The windmill's blades groaned in protest against the relentless Utah wind, and Clara Rose knew if she didn't fix it within the hour, every head of cattle on the ranch would be without water by nightfall. She climbed the wooden ladder with determination etched into every line of her sun-weathered face, her calico work dress gathered carefully to keep from snagging on the weathered rungs. 30 feet below, Quinlan Yates stood with his hat pushed back on his head, watching his boss's widowed daughter scale that tower like she'd been born to it, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear for her safety, and everything to do with the stubborn set of her jaw. It was June of 1887, and the high desert heat of Provo, Utah, beat down on the Riston Ranch with the kind of intensity that made mirages dance on the horizon. Clara had been back at her father's ranch for 3 months now, ever since her husband Thomas had been thrown from a spooked horse down in Colorado and broke his neck on impact. She was 23 years old and already a widow, returned to the only home she'd ever truly known with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and a heart that felt like it had been carved hollow. Her father, William Riston, owned the largest cattle operation in Utah County, and he'd welcomed her back without question, though his health had been failing in the year she'd been gone. Quinlan had been foreman of the Riston Ranch for 2 years, promoted when he was just 26 because he had a way with horses that bordered on magical, and a work ethic that put every other hand on the ranch to shame. He'd seen Clara exactly 3 times before she'd married Thomas Miller and moved away. Once at a church social when she was 17, and he was a lowly ranch hand who didn't dare speak to the boss's daughter. Once when she'd come riding through the south pasture on a paint mare, her dark hair flying behind her like a banner. And once at her wedding, where he'd stood in the back of the church and told himself he was a fool for feeling like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart until it couldn't beat properly. Now she was back, and she was broken, and Quinlan didn't know what to do with the way his pulse kicked up every time he saw her walking across the ranch yard with that determined stride that said she wasn't going to let grief flatten her into dust. "Miss Clara," he called up now, cupping his hands around his mouth. "You want me to send Jimmy up there with the tools?" She didn't look down, just kept climbing until she reached the platform near the top where the gearbox sat exposed to the elements. "Jimmy's out with the herd." "I can manage this myself." Quinlan felt his jaw tighten. Clara had always been independent, even as a girl, but since she'd come home there was a hardness to her independence that felt like armor. She did everything herself, spoke to everyone with polite distance, and worked from sunup to sundown like she was trying to outrun something that lived inside her own skin. The ladder creaked ominously, and Quinlan made a decision. He grabbed his wrench from where it hung on his belt and started climbing. The wood was hot under his calloused palms, worn smooth by years of use and baked by the unforgiving sun. When he reached the platform, Clara was already elbow-deep in the gearbox, her hands black with grease and her brow furrowed in concentration. "I said I could manage," she told him without looking up. "I know what you said." Quinlan settled himself on the platform, keeping his weight distributed carefully. The whole structure swayed slightly in the wind, and he could see the ground far below through the gaps in the wooden slats. "But I'm the foreman of this ranch, and it's my job to make sure the equipment gets fixed right." She did look at him then, and her eyes were the color of summer grass after a rain, startlingly green in her sun-browned face. "And you think I can't fix it right?" "I didn't say that." "You implied it." She turned back to the gearbox, her fingers working at a bolt that had rusted solid. "I've been fixing windmills since I was 16 years old, Mr. Yates. My father taught me everything there is to know about this ranch." Quinlan watched her struggle with the bolt for another moment, then held out his wrench. It was longer than the one she had, with better leverage. "Try this." Clara stared at the tool for a long moment, and he could see the war happening behind her eyes. Pride versus practicality. Independence versus accepting help. Finally, she took the wrench from his hand, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and something electric shot up his arm at the contact. "Thank you," she said, and the words sounded like they'd been dragged out of her. The bolt gave way under the better leverage, and Clara made a small sound of satisfaction. Quinlan found himself watching the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, turning it almost auburn where it had escaped from the practical bun at the nape of her neck. She had a smudge of grease on her cheekbone, and sweat had dampened the collar of her dress, and he thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. "The gear teeth are stripped," Clara announced, pulling the mechanism out to examine it more closely. "We'll need to replace the whole assembly." "We've got a spare in the barn," Quinlan said. "I can ride back and get it." She shook her head. "By the time you ride back and climb up here again, we'll have lost another hour. I'll go down and get it myself. Miss Clara." He said it gently, like he was gentling one of the green horses in the breaking pen. "Let me help, please." She looked at him again, really looked at him this time, and he wondered what she saw. He wasn't much to look at, he knew. His nose had been broken twice, once by a horse's head, and once in a fight with a drifter who'd tried to rustle cattle off the North Range. His face was too angular, all sharp cheekbones and a jaw that could have been carved from granite. His hair was the color of dusty straw, and his eyes were an unremarkable brown. But he was honest, and he was loyal, and he wanted to help her so badly it felt like an ache in his bones. "All right," she said finally. "You go get the gear assembly. I'll clean out the housing while you're gone." Quinlan nodded and started back down the ladder. The ride to the barn took 10 minutes, and he spent every one of them thinking about the way Clara's guard had dropped for just a moment when she'd looked at him. Like she was tired of carrying everything alone but didn't know how to ask for help. Like she was drowning and trying to convince everyone she was just swimming. He found the spare gear assembly right where he remembered, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it from rusting. The barn was dim and cool after the blazing heat outside, and for a moment he just stood there, holding the heavy piece of machinery and trying to get his thoughts in order. Clara Rose was his boss's daughter. She was recently widowed. She was grieving and vulnerable and completely off limits to a ranch foreman who'd grown up the son of a drunk and a washerwoman. There was a chasm between their worlds that couldn't be crossed, no matter how much he might want to. But when he climbed back up that ladder and saw her sitting on the platform with her legs dangling over the edge, looking out across the ranch land that stretched to the mountains in the distance, all his sensible thoughts scattered like dandelion seeds on the wind. "Your father used to bring me up here when I was little," Clara said without turning around. "He'd point out the boundaries of the ranch, tell me stories about how he and my mother built this place from nothing. She died when I was 8. Did you know that?" "I knew," Quinlan said softly, settling beside her with the gear assembly in his lap. "Everyone thinks because my father owns all this land that I grew up soft." She gestured at the vast expanse below them. "But I didn't. My father made sure I could do everything a son could do. Rope cattle, break horses, fix equipment, manage accounts. He said land like this doesn't respect weakness, and neither should I." "You're not weak," Quinlan said. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I feel weak. I feel like I'm made of paper and the wind could tear me apart any second." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only true thing he could think of. "You're the strongest person I know." Clara turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You don't know me at all, Mr. Yates." "Then let me," he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a rope bridge spanning an impossible distance. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The windmill creaked, the blades turning slowly now that they weren't locked up by the broken gear. Down below, a meadowlark sang from a fence post, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. The whole world seemed to be holding its breath. Then Clara stood up, brushing off her skirt, and the moment shattered. "We should finish this before the sun gets any higher. The cattle will need water." They worked in silence after that, their hands moving in practiced synchronization. Clara held components in place while Quinlan tightened bolts. He supported her weight when she had to lean out over the edge to reach a stubborn coupling. She handed him tools before he had to ask for them. It was a kind of dance, intimate in its efficiency, and by the time they'd finished and climbed back down to solid ground, Quinlan felt like something fundamental had shifted between them. "Thank you for the help," Clara said, wiping her hands on a rag she'd tucked into her belt. Her face was flushed from exertion and heat, and strands of hair clung to her damp forehead. "I suppose I couldn't have managed that last coupling alone." "You're welcome." Quinlan retrieved his wrench from where she'd set it on the ground, sliding it back into his belt. "Miss Clara, I want you to know that if you ever need help with anything at all, you only have to ask." She studied him for a long moment, and he felt like those green eyes were seeing straight through to the core of him. "Why? Why what? Why do you care? You barely know me." "I'm just the boss's daughter who came home because she had nowhere else to go." Quinlan took a breath, and decided that if he was going to be honest, he might as well be completely honest. "I've watched you ride across this ranch like you were born in the saddle. I've seen you doctor a sick calf and stay up all night to make sure it lived. I've heard you talking to the horses in the breaking pen, gentle and patient even when they're fighting you every step. You're not just the boss's daughter, Clara. You're the heart of this ranch, and you always have been." Her lips parted in surprise, and color bloomed high on her cheekbones that had nothing to do with the heat. "Mr. Yates, Quinlan," he said. "Just Quinlan, please. Quinlan." His name on her lips did something to his insides, twisted them up and set them singing all at once. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything." He settled his hat more firmly on his head, needing something to do with his hands before he did something stupid like reach out and brush that strand of hair away from her face. "I just wanted you to know you're not alone here. Even if you feel like you are." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of hoofbeats thundered toward them. 3 riders appeared over the rise, moving fast, and even from a distance Quinlan could tell something was wrong. He recognized Pete Sanderson, one of the ranch hands in the lead with 2 others flanking him. Pete hauled his horse to a stop in a spray of dust and gravel. "Foreman, we've got trouble. Big trouble." Quinlan's body went tense, shifting instantly into the mindset that had made him good at his job. "What kind of trouble?" "Rustlers hit the north herd last night. Looks like they made off with at least 50 head, maybe more. We found where they cut the fence and drove them through." Clara stepped forward before Quinlan could respond. "My father keeps the most valuable breeding stock in that herd. Those are animals we can't afford to lose." "No, madam," Pete agreed, his weathered face grim. "That's why I came straight here instead of trying to track them myself. This is a job for the law." "The law is 3 days away in Salt Lake City," Quinlan said, his mind already racing through options. "By the time a marshal gets here and organizes a posse, those cattle will be halfway to Nevada." "Then we go after them ourselves," Clara said, and there was steel in her voice that brooked no argument. "This is our land, our cattle, our responsibility." Quinlan turned to her, already shaking his head. "Miss Clara, tracking rustlers isn't like fixing a windmill. These men are armed and dangerous, and they won't think twice about shooting anyone who comes after them. I'm aware of that." She crossed her arms over her chest, and he recognized that stubborn set to her jaw. "I'm also aware that my father is too ill to lead a recovery party himself, and as his daughter and heir, that responsibility falls to me." "It falls to me," Quinlan corrected. "I'm the foreman. Managing ranch security is my job, and it's my ranch," Clara shot back, "or it will be someday. Those are my cattle, my livelihood, my future. I'm going after them." Pete and the other two hands exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of this argument, especially not between the foreman and the boss's daughter. Quinlan took off his hat and ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, trying to find a way to make her understand without insulting her capability. "Clara, I know you're a better rider than half the men on this ranch. I know you can shoot straight and you're not afraid of hard work. But this isn't about any of that. This is about men who have already shown they're willing to steal and who won't hesitate to do worse if they're cornered. Then it's a good thing I'll have the foreman of the Riston Ranch with me," she said, and her smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Because you are coming with me, aren't you? Unless you plan to tie me up in the barn, which I promise you wouldn't end well for either of us." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Quinlan felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "You're not giving me much choice." "No," Clara agreed. "I'm not." He sighed and turned to Pete. "How many men can we spare from the ranch operations?" "4, maybe 5 if we push it, but we'll need to leave someone competent in charge of the daily work. Leave Frank in charge. He's got enough experience." Quinlan's mind was already shifting gears, moving from opposition to planning. "We'll need provisions for at least a week, ammunition, and the best horses we've got. Tell the men to meet at the main barn in an hour, ready to ride hard." Pete nodded and wheeled his horse around, the other hands following. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving Quinlan and Clara standing alone in the shadow of the windmill. "You didn't have to agree to let me come," Clara said quietly. "Yes, I did." Quinlan met her eyes. "Because you meant what you said about going anyway, and I'd rather have you where I can keep an eye on you than have you follow along behind and get yourself killed." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That's fair. But Quinlan, I need you to understand something. I know everyone looks at me and sees a grieving widow who needs to be handled gently. But I can't be that person. If I let myself be soft, if I let myself break, I don't think I'll be able to put the pieces back together." He understood that more than she knew. He'd grown up watching his mother do the same thing, work herself to the bone so she wouldn't have time to think about the husband who drank away every penny they had. Keep moving, keep working, because standing still meant feeling, and feeling hurt too much. "All right," he said. "Then we ride together as equals. But Clara, if things go bad out there, if shooting starts, I need you to promise me you'll take cover. Not because you're a woman or because you're fragile, but because your father has already lost his wife and his health is failing. I won't be the one who has to tell him he's lost his daughter too." Clara's expression softened slightly. "I promise, and Quinlan, thank you for not treating me like I'm made of glass." "You're not made of glass," he said. "You're made of the same hard earth and strong will as this land. Anyone who can't see that is a fool." The look she gave him then made his heart stutter in his chest. It was warm and wondering, like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him, and finding something there she hadn't expected. "We should get ready," she said finally, breaking the spell. "An hour isn't much time." They walked back to the main ranch buildings together, the heat of the day pressing down on them like a physical weight. The Riston Ranch was a sprawling complex of barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings, all centered around the main house where Clara and her father lived. It had been built with an eye toward both function and permanence, heavy timber construction that could withstand the harsh Utah winters and the brutal summer heat. Clara went to the house to change into riding clothes and gather her gear, while Quinlan headed for the barn to select horses and organize supplies. He chose his own mount first, a rangy buckskin gelding named Dust who had bottomless stamina and a level head in a crisis. For Clara, he selected a gray mare called Silver who was quick and sure-footed. The other hands could choose their own mounts, but he made sure they took the freshest horses they had, ones that could handle days of hard riding. He was checking the loads in his rifle when Clara emerged from the house wearing split riding skirts, a plain cotton shirt, and a leather vest. Her hair was braided tight against her head, and she had a Winchester rifle slung over her shoulder and a revolver holstered at her hip. She looked capable and determined and beautiful enough to make his mouth go dry. "I told my father we're going after the cattle," she said, walking up to where he stood in the barn's shadow. "He wanted to come himself, but he can barely make it from his bed to his chair these days. It kills him to be so helpless." "He's lucky to have you," Quinlan said, and meant it. Clara's smile was sad. "I'm not sure about that. If I'd been here instead of in Colorado, maybe I would have noticed something was wrong earlier. Maybe I could have prevented this." "You can't think like that." Rustlers are opportunists. They watch and wait for the right moment, and they would have struck eventually no matter what you did or didn't do. She nodded, but he could tell she didn't fully believe him. They finished loading the pack horses in silence, working with the same efficient coordination they'd displayed on the Windmill. By the time the other hands arrived, everything was ready. Pete Sanderson was there, along with Jimmy Keller, a young hand who was quick with a rope. Marcus Webb, a former soldier who'd fought in the Indian Wars and knew how to track. And Sam Thornton, a steady presence who'd been with the ranch for a decade. They were good men, loyal and capable, and Quinlan was glad to have them at his back. "Here's what we know," Quinlan said, gathering them all together. "The rustlers hit sometime last night, probably in the early morning hours when everyone was sleeping deepest. They cut the fence on the North Range and drove off at least 50 head of cattle. Miss Clara and I will be leading this recovery party, and I want everyone clear on the rules. We track them down, we assess the situation, and we make smart decisions. I'd rather lose the cattle than lose a man. Is that understood?" Everyone nodded, though Quinlan could see the fighting spirit in their eyes. These were men who took pride in their work, and rustling was a personal insult to every one of them. "Let's ride," Clara said, swinging into Silver's saddle with practiced ease. They rode north in a tight group, following Pete to the place where the fence had been cut. The sun was past its zenith now, angling toward late afternoon, and the heat was relentless. Sweat ran down Quinlan's back and soaked into his shirt, and he could see the horses' flanks darkening with moisture. They'd need to water the animals soon, but first he wanted to see the scene of the crime. The fence line was obvious when they reached it. The barbed wire had been cut cleanly, not torn, and the posts on either side had been pulled up to create a wide gap. The ground was churned up with hoofprints, both cattle and horses, all heading northwest toward rougher country. Marcus swung down from his horse and walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground with the intensity of a man who'd spent years reading signs. 4 riders, he announced after a few minutes. Maybe 5. Hard to tell with all the cattle prints muddying things up. But they knew what they were doing. Cut the fence, spooked the herd just enough to get them moving, then kept them bunched tight as they drove them out. "Can you track them?" Quinlan asked. "In this?" Marcus gestured at the hard, packed earth, baked dry by the sun. "It won't be easy, but yeah. Trail's fresh enough that we shouldn't lose it unless we hit rock, or they split up to cover their tracks." Then let's move, Clara said. Every minute we waste is another mile between us and those cattle. They followed the trail northwest, riding in single file with Marcus in the lead. The land grew rougher as they went, rising into foothills thick with sage and juniper. The tracks were harder to see here, scattered across rocky soil, but Marcus never wavered. He'd stop occasionally, dismount to examine a broken branch or a scrape on a rock, then continue on with quiet confidence. They rode until dusk, stopping only to water the horses at a small spring Marcus knew about. Quinlan called a halt as the sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. "We camp here," he announced, pointing to a small hollow that would shelter them from the wind and hide their fire from casual observation. "No one talks louder than necessary, and we keep the fire small. I want 2 men on watch at all times, rotating every 2 hours." The hands set about making camp with practiced efficiency. Sam got a fire going while Pete and Jimmy saw to the horses. Marcus walked the perimeter, his rifle cradled in his arms, checking for any signs of trouble. Clara unsaddled Silver herself, rubbing the mare down with a handful of dry grass before hobbling her to graze. Quinlan watched her work, noting the care she took with her mount, the way she spoke softly to the horse and checked her hooves for stones. Everything about the way she moved spoke of someone who'd grown up around animals, who understood them not as tools but as partners. "You should eat something," he said, walking over with a plate of beans and hardtack that Sam had prepared. "It's not much, but it'll keep your strength up." Clara accepted the plate with a tired smile. "Thank you. I'll be honest, I'm not sure I could eat anything after the day we've had, but I know you're right." They sat together a little apart from the others, eating in companionable silence. The night was cool after the brutal heat of the day, and stars were beginning to emerge overhead, so many of them they looked like scattered salt across black cloth. "My husband used to say the stars were the same no matter where you were," Clara said quietly. "That you could be in Colorado or Utah or anywhere else in the world, and you'd still be looking at the same sky." It was the first time she'd mentioned her husband voluntarily, and Quinlan went very still, afraid that any movement might make her stop talking. "I think he meant it to be comforting," she continued. "Like no matter how far apart we were still connected by something. But after he died, it just made me feel small. Like nothing I did mattered because the universe was so vast, and I was just one tiny person trying to make sense of it all." "You're not small," Quinlan said. "You're not insignificant. You matter to your father, to the people who work this ranch, to those cattle we're chasing down. Your husband was right that the stars are the same everywhere, but that doesn't mean you're small. It means you're part of something bigger." Clara looked at him, and in the firelight her eyes were liquid and dark. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just know what it's like to feel like you don't matter. My father drank himself to death when I was 15, and my mother worked herself into an early grave trying to make up for it. I spent a lot of years thinking I was destined for the same thing, that I'd just drift from ranch to ranch until I was too old and broken to be useful, and then I'd die in some bunkhouse somewhere, unmourned and forgotten." "But you didn't," Clara said softly. "No. Because your father took a chance on me. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and he gave me responsibility and trust. He made me matter, Clara, the same way you matter, whether you believe it or not." She set her plate aside and moved closer to him, and Quinlan's heart kicked into a faster rhythm. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "I know I was stubborn about coming on this trip, and I know you're only letting me be here because I didn't give you a choice, but I'm glad it's you I'm riding with." "I'm glad too," he said, and it was the truest thing he'd said all day, They sat there for a long time, not talking, just existing in the same space. Around them, the camp settled into the rhythms of the trail. Sam banked the fire. Pete and Jimmy rolled out their bedrolls. Marcus took first watch, positioning himself on a small rise where he could see the approaches to their camp. Eventually, Clara stood and stretched, her spine popping audibly. "I should try to get some sleep. Morning will come early." "It will," Quinlan agreed, standing as well. "But Clara, before you go, I want to say something." She paused, looking up at him with those green eyes that seemed to see straight through his defenses. "What is it?" "Whatever happens out here, whatever we find when we catch up to those rustlers, I want you to know that I'm proud to be riding with you. Not because you're the boss's daughter, but because you're one of the bravest people I've ever known." Color flooded her cheeks, visible even in the dim firelight. "Quinlan, I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything." He smiled, trying to lighten the moment. "Just get some rest. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." She nodded and turned toward her bedroll, then stopped and looked back at him. "For what it's worth, I'm proud to be riding with you too. You're a good man, Quinlan Yates, better than you give yourself credit for." Then she was gone, settling into her blankets on the far side of the fire, and Quinlan was left standing there feeling like the entire world had just shifted on its axis. He took second watch with Pete, and when his turn came, he sat on that little rise with his rifle across his knees and watched the stars wheel overhead, and thought about green eyes and stubborn determination, and the way his name had sounded on Clara's lips. They broke camp at first light, eating a cold breakfast of jerky and water because there wasn't time for anything more. The trail was harder to follow in the morning, the tracks scattered and faint, but Marcus stayed on it with the tenacity of a hound. They climbed higher into the foothills, following dry washes and narrow canyons, always heading northwest. Around midday, Marcus held up his hand for silence. Everyone froze, hands moving instinctively to weapons. In the distance, carried on the wind, came the sound of cattle lowing. It was faint but unmistakable, and Quinlan felt a surge of satisfaction. They'd found them. "How do you want to play this?" Marcus asked quietly, reining his horse back to ride beside Quinlan and Clara. "Carefully," Quinlan said. "We don't know how many rustlers there are or how well armed they might be. I want to scout the situation before we do anything else." Clara nodded. "There's high ground to the west. If we can get up there without being seen, we should be able to see their camp." They left the horses with Sam in a protected draw and proceeded on foot, moving as quietly as possible through the sage and scrub oak. The high ground Clara had spotted was a rocky outcropping that gave them a view of the valley below, and what they saw made Quinlan's jaw tighten. The rustlers had made a temporary camp in a box canyon with good grass and a small stream. The stolen cattle were there, all 50-plus head, bunched together near the water. 4 men sat around a fire, eating what looked like a late breakfast. Their horses were picketed nearby, and Quinlan could see rifles within easy reach of each man. 4 of them, 6 of us, Pete whispered. "Those are good odds." "Odds don't mean anything if someone gets killed," Quinlan replied. "We need to be smart about this." Clara had her field glasses out, studying the camp intently. "I recognize one of them, the tall one with the gray hat. His name is Cutter Brennan. He worked for my father 2 years ago until we caught him stealing tools from the barn and fired him." "That explains how they knew when and where to hit," Marcus said grimly. "Inside knowledge." Quinlan felt anger kindle in his chest. Rustling was one thing, a crime of opportunity that happened on every ranch sooner or later. But this was betrayal, planned and executed by someone who'd eaten Ristan food and taken Ristan pay. That made it personal. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, his voice low and hard. "Clara, You and Pete circle around to the north end of the canyon. If they try to run that way with the cattle, you cut them off. Marcus, you and Jimmy take the south. Sam and I will come straight down the middle and give them a chance to surrender." "And if they don't surrender," Clara asked, "then we do what has to be done." "But I want to give them that chance first. I'm not looking to start a war if we can avoid it." Everyone nodded and began moving into position. Quinlan watched Clara slip away through the rocks with Pete, moving with the grace of someone who knew how to walk quietly in rough country. He waited until he saw them reach the north rim of the canyon, then nodded to Sam. They worked their way down the slope, using the terrain for cover, until they were close enough that Quinlan could smell the smoke from the rustlers' fire. Then he stepped out into the open with his rifle leveled and his voice carrying across the morning air. "This is Quinlan Yates, foreman of the Raston Ranch. You're surrounded and outgunned. Drop your weapons and step away from the fire, and nobody has to get hurt." For a frozen moment, nothing happened. The four rustlers stared at him like he'd materialized out of thin air. Then Cutter Brennan's face twisted into a snarl, and he lunged for his rifle. Everything happened at once. Sam fired a warning shot that kicked up dust at Brennan's feet. The other rustlers scattered, diving for cover and their weapons. Gunfire erupted from the north rim where Clara and Pete were positioned, not aiming to kill but to pin the rustlers down and keep them from reaching their horses. Marcus and Jimmy added their fire from the south, creating a crossfire that had the rustlers trapped. "Give it up," Quinlan shouted. "There's nowhere to run." But Brennan was either too stupid or too proud to listen. He got his hands on his rifle and swung it toward Quinlan, and Quinlan had no choice. He fired once, a shot that took Brennan in the shoulder and spun him around. The rifle flew from his hands, and he went down hard, clutching his wounded shoulder and cursing. The other three rustlers froze, their hands in the air, their weapons on the ground. The entire fight had lasted less than a minute, and the only casualty was the man who'd started it. "Smart choice," Quinlan said, walking forward with his rifle still leveled. "Sam, secure their weapons. Marcus, Jimmy, get down here and tie them up." The next hour was spent rounding up the prisoners and checking on the cattle. Brennan's shoulder wound was serious but not life-threatening, and Clara bound it up with strips torn from one of the rustlers' shirts, her hands steady and competent despite the violence they'd just been through. "You're a traitor," she told Brennan as she worked. "My father trusted you, gave you work when you needed it, and this is how you repay him," Brennan spat into the dust. "Your father is a tyrant who owns half of Utah County and still wants more. I took what I was owed." "You were owed nothing," Clara said coldly. "You were paid fairly for your work, and when you stole from us, you lost any claim to fairness." Quinlan laid a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension thrumming through her. "That's enough. Let him stew in his own bitterness. We've got cattle to move and prisoners to transport." They spent the rest of the day preparing for the journey back. The cattle were scattered after the gunfight, and it took hours to round them all up and get them settled. The prisoners were tied to their horses, hands bound and ropes connecting them in a line, so they couldn't try to escape without all of them making the attempt at once. By the time they started back toward the Raston Ranch, the sun was sinking toward the western horizon again, and Quinlan was bone-tired. But there was also satisfaction in his chest, the knowledge that they'd recovered the stolen property and captured the men responsible without losing anyone from their own party. That night, they camped in the same hollow they'd used on the way out. The prisoners were tied securely away from the fire, and Pete and Jimmy took first watch over them. The rest of the crew settled in to rest, and Quinlan found himself sitting beside Clara again, sharing a meal and watching the stars emerge. "You were right," Clara said quietly, "about giving them a chance to surrender. I was ready to go in with guns blazing, but you kept your head and thought it through. That's why you're foreman, I suppose." "I've just been doing this longer," Quinlan said, "and I've seen what happens when things go bad." "There's no pride in killing a man, Clara. Even if he deserves it, it stays with you." She looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been something deeper. "Have you ever killed anyone?" "Once." The word came out harder than he meant it to. "A horse thief who drew on me when I tried to stop him. I was 22 years old and thought I was invincible. When he went down, when I saw the light go out of his eyes, I realized how wrong I'd been. Every life matters, even the lives of people who make bad choices. I don't forget that." Clara reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and calloused against his. "You're a good man, Quinlan. I meant what I said last night, better than you give yourself credit for." He looked down at their joined hands, and his heart was beating so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "Clara, I need you to know something. These past few days, riding with you, fighting beside you, I've felt more alive than I have in years. You make me want to be better than I am, to be the man you seem to think I am." "You already are that man," she said softly. "You just can't see it yet." They sat there for a long time, hands joined, watching the fire burn down to embers. Around them, the camp settled into sleep, but Quinlan felt like he could stay awake forever, suspended in this moment where everything seemed possible. Finally, Clara squeezed his hand and stood. "I should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." "It will," Quinlan agreed, standing as well, but when she would have pulled away, he held on to her hand for a moment longer. "Clara, wait." She turned back, and in the starlight her face was pale and beautiful. "What is it?" "I don't want to overstep. I know you're still grieving your husband, and I know there's a world of difference between a ranch foreman and the boss's daughter. But I need you to know that my feelings for you are real. I'm not expecting anything, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that you matter to me, more than you probably should." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then she stepped closer, so close he could feel the heat of her body, and looked up into his face. "Quinlan, my husband has been dead for 3 months. Before that, our marriage was already dying. We married too young and we wanted different things. He wanted to build his own ranch to prove himself separate from my father's legacy. I just wanted to come home. We spent more time arguing than talking, and when he died, I felt guilty because part of me was relieved. Does that make me a terrible person? No," Quinlan said fiercely. "It makes you human." "I've been so angry," Clara continued, and now there were tears streaming down her face. "Angry at him for dying. Angry at myself for not loving him the way I should have. Angry at God for taking away my choices. I came home to my father's ranch thinking I'd just throw myself into work and never feel anything again. But then you had to go and be kind to me. You had to see me as more than just a grieving widow or the boss's daughter. You had to make me feel things I thought I'd buried forever." Quinlan raised his free hand and wiped away her tears with his thumb, the gesture achingly gentle. "I'm not sorry for that. I know the timing is terrible, and I know this is complicated, but I'm not sorry." "I'm not either," Clara whispered. Then she rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative and sweet as honey. The world stopped. Quinlan's entire universe narrowed to the sensation of her lips against his. The way her hand tightened on his. The small sound she made in the back of her throat that might have been surprise or relief or joy. He kissed her back with all the pent-up longing he'd been carrying for years, one hand cupping her face like she was made of something precious and rare. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara laughed shakily. "Well, that happened." "It did," Quinlan agreed, and he couldn't stop smiling. "Clara, I don't," she said, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Don't say anything you might regret. Let's just take this one day at a time, all right? I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it, however that looks." "One day at a time," Quinlan repeated. "I can do that." She kissed him once more, brief and fierce, then pulled away and disappeared into the shadows. Quinlan stood there for a long time, his lips still tingling, his heart full to bursting. When he finally lay down in his bedroll, he couldn't sleep for the joy that thrummed through his veins like lightning. The journey back to the ranch took 2 more days. They had to move slowly with the cattle, keeping them calm and together, and the prisoners slowed them down even more. But Quinlan didn't mind. Every day meant more time riding beside Clara, more stolen conversations and shared smiles, more moments where their eyes would meet across the herd and the air between them would crackle with unspoken promise. On the evening of the second day, they crested a rise and saw the Riston ranch spread out below them in the valley. The windmill's blades turned steadily in the wind, the one they'd fixed together just days before. The sight of it made Quinlan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Home," Clara said softly beside him. "I never thought I'd be so glad to see it." They drove the cattle back into the north pasture and handed the prisoners over to the sheriff's deputy who'd been summoned from Provo. William Riston came out of the house to meet them, leaning heavily on a cane but with fire still burning in his eyes. "You did it," he said, gripping Quinlan's shoulder with surprising strength. "You brought them back, all of them." "We had help," Quinlan said, nodding toward Clara. "Your daughter is as tough as they come, sir. She never wavered, never complained, and she held her own in the fight." William turned to Clara and his expression softened. "I never doubted it. She's her mother's daughter, after all, strong as the land itself." Clara hugged her father carefully, mindful of his frailty. "I'm glad to be home, Papa, but I'm even more glad we got your cattle back." "Our cattle," William corrected. "This ranch is yours as much as it is mine, daughter. Never forget that." That night there was a celebration in the bunkhouse. The hands broke out a bottle of whiskey someone had been saving, and there were stories and laughter and the kind of camaraderie that came from shared danger and shared victory. Quinlan participated, but his mind was only half there. The other half was watching Clara across the room, the way the lamplight caught in her hair, the way she laughed at one of Pete's jokes, the way her eyes would find his and hold for just a moment too long. When the party finally wound down and everyone stumbled off to their bedrolls, Quinlan walked out into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. He heard footsteps behind him and knew without turning that it was Clara. "Tired of celebrating?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Tired of pretending I'm focused on anything other than you," he said honestly. She laughed, the sound soft and warm. "Good, because I feel the same way." She paused, then added, "My father asked me tonight if there was anything between us. Between you and me, I mean." Quinlan's heart stuttered. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, that I care about you, that I think you might be the best man I've ever known, and that I need time to figure out what that means, but I'm not going to hide it." "And what did he say?" "He said he'd suspected as much, and that he couldn't think of anyone he'd rather have his daughter care for than his foreman. Then he told me he expects you to court me properly, and if you hurt me, he'll come after you himself, even if he has to do it from a wheelchair." Quinlan felt relief and terror wash over him in equal measure. "I would never hurt you, Clara, not if I could help it. I know." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "So what do you say, Quinlan Yates? Will you court me properly? Will you come to dinner at the main house and sit in the parlor with my father glaring at you and bring me flowers and all the rest of it?" "If that's what it takes to be with you, I'll do it gladly," Quinlan said. "Though I have to warn you, I'm not much for sitting still in parlors. I'm better at fixing windmills and chasing down rustlers." "Lucky for you. I prefer a man who can fix windmills and chase down rustlers," Clara said. "Parlor sitting is overrated anyway." They stood there for a while, hands joined, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the ranch. It felt to Quinlan like a beginning, like the first page of a story that had been waiting years to be written. Over the following weeks, Quinlan did court Clara properly, or as properly as two busy people running a ranch could manage. He came to dinner at the main house twice a week, enduring William's sharp questions and sharper scrutiny with good humor. He brought Clara wildflowers from the high meadows, and she laughed and put them in a vase on her windowsill. They rode out together to check the herds, and sometimes they'd find excuses to stop in a sheltered valley or beside a clear stream, and they'd sit close and talk about everything and nothing. William's health continued to decline through the summer and into fall. By October, he was confined to his bed most days, and it was clear to everyone that his time was limited. He called Quinlan to his bedside one afternoon when Clara was out checking on some pregnant mares. "Sit down, son," William said, his voice thin but still commanding. "There's things I need to say while I still can." Quinlan sat in the chair beside the bed, his hat in his hands. "I'm listening, sir." "You love my daughter," William said. "It wasn't a question." "I do," Quinlan admitted. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "Good. Because I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it truly. This ranch, all of this land and cattle and legacy, it's going to be Clara's when I'm gone. She's capable of running it herself, and I've made sure she knows how. But running a ranch this size is brutal work, and doing it alone is twice as brutal. She needs a partner, Quinlan. Someone who loves the land as much as she does, who'll stand beside her through drought and plenty, through good years and bad. Can you be that person?" "Yes, sir," Quinlan said without hesitation. "If she'll have me." William smiled, and it transformed his worn face for a moment, making him look years younger. "She'll have you. I'd bet this ranch on it, but Quinlan, I need you to promise me something. Don't wait too long to ask her. Life is shorter than we think, and chances slip away faster than we realize. If you love her, tell her. If you want to marry her, ask. Don't waste the time I wasted after my wife died thinking there'd always be more of it." "I promise," Quinlan said, his throat tight. "Thank you, sir. For everything. For giving me a chance, for trusting me with the ranch, for trusting me with your daughter." "You earned it all," William said. "Now get out of here and let an old man rest, and Quinlan, welcome to the family. Might as well make it official now, because we both know how this story ends." William Reston died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was held on a crisp November day, and it seemed like half of Utah County turned out to pay their respects. He'd been a hard man, but a fair one, respected if not always liked, and his passing marked the end of an era. Clara stood at the graveside with her head high and her eyes dry, and Quinlan stood beside her, his hand a steady presence on her back. When the service was over and the crowds had dispersed, she finally let herself cry, and Quinlan held her while she sobbed out her grief and exhaustion, and the weight of all the responsibility that now rested on her shoulders. "I'm not ready," she said against his chest. "I'm not ready to do this alone." "You're not alone," Quinlan told her fiercely. "You'll never be alone, Clara. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back to look at him, and her face was blotchy and red from crying, and he thought she'd never been more beautiful. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me you'll stay no matter how hard things get." "I promise," he said. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I know the timing is terrible, but I made a promise to your father and I intend to keep it." She looked confused. "What promise?" Quinlan took a breath and dropped to one knee right there beside her father's grave, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. He'd bought it in Provo the week before, using every penny he'd saved over the past 2 years. Clara Rose, I've loved you since before I knew what love was. You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life standing beside you, working with you, building a future with you. Will you marry me? Clara stared at him, and for a moment Quinlan's heart sank. He'd misread everything, moved too fast, assumed too much. But then her face broke into a radiant smile and she was laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, she said. Yes, you ridiculous man, of course I'll marry you. I thought you'd never ask. He slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, sweeping her into his arms and kissing her right there in the cemetery, and neither of them cared who might see. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara pressed her forehead to his. My father would have loved this, she said. He always said life was for the living, and we should never waste a moment of it. Then let's not waste it, Quinlan said. Let's build something together, Clara, something that will last. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the church in Provo. Clara wore a simple cream-colored dress, and Quinlan wore his best suit, and they spoke their vows with all the ranch hands and half the town as witnesses. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Quinlan kissed his bride, there was a cheer that could be heard all the way to the mountains. The years that followed were good ones, though not without their challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, cattle that sickened and fences that needed mending, hands that needed hiring and firing, and 1,000 other problems that came with running a ranch the size of the Riston spread. But through it all, Clara and Quinlan faced everything together, partners in the truest sense of the word. Clara ran the business side of the ranch with the same sharp mind her father had possessed, negotiating deals that made other ranchers shake their heads in admiration. Quinlan managed the daily operations, his natural leadership and deep knowledge of ranching making him respected throughout the territory. Together, they expanded the operation, buying up adjacent land when it became available, improving their breeding stock, and building a reputation for quality that attracted buyers from as far away as Chicago. 3 years into their marriage, Clara gave birth to their first child, a son they named William after her father. He came into the world screaming his lungs out, with a shock of dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and Quinlan fell in love all over again. Watching Clara with their son, seeing the fierce tenderness in her face as she nursed him, Quinlan understood for the first time what true contentment felt like. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, and they named her Margaret after Clara's mother. She was quieter than her brother, more observant, with Quinlan's brown eyes and a thoughtful expression that made people smile. Clara joked that they'd gotten the best of both worlds, a son who would charge through life like a bull and a daughter who would think everything through first. The children grew up as ranch children did, learning to ride almost before they could walk, understanding the rhythms of the seasons and the hard work that went into maintaining the land. William was 7 and Margaret was 5 when Quinlan took them up to the Windmill, the same one he and Clara had fixed together all those years ago. Your mother and I met here, he told them, standing on the platform while they gazed out at the ranch spread below. Well, not met exactly. I'd seen her before, but this is where I really saw her for the first time, where I understood who she was. What do you mean, Papa? Margaret asked, holding tight to his hand. I mean I saw how strong she was, how capable, how she didn't need anyone to rescue her, but she was gracious enough to accept help when it was offered. And I fell in love with her, right here on this platform, though I didn't have the sense to admit it for a while after. That's not very smart, William said with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old. Quinlan laughed. No, it wasn't. but sometimes we're slow to recognize the best things in our lives. Don't make the same mistake I did. When you find something or someone worth holding on to, you hold on tight and don't let go. From the ground below, Clara's voice called up to them. Are you filling our children's heads with romantic nonsense again? It's not nonsense if it's true, Quinlan called back, grinning. Clara climbed the ladder to join them, moving with the same confident grace she'd always had. At 33, she was even more beautiful than she'd been at 23, her face showing the character lines of someone who'd lived fully and worked hard. She settled beside Quinlan on the platform, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and together they looked out at the land they'd built a life on. I was thinking, Clara said, maybe it's time we got another windmill for the east pasture. That spring barely keeps up with the cattle we've got grazing out there now. I was thinking the same thing, Quinlan said, though I'm hoping the installation goes smoother than this one did. What do you mean? William asked. Clara and Quinlan exchanged a look, and she smiled. Your father means the day we fixed this windmill was the day that changed both our lives. Sometimes the hard things, the challenging things, turn out to be the best things in disguise. As the sun began to set, painting the Utah sky in shades of gold and crimson, the family climbed down from the windmill together. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the children running ahead, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, filled with the comfortable clutter of a family that actually lived there rather than just existed. Over dinner that night, they talked about plans for the ranch, about the school lessons the children were working on, about the new foal in the barn that William was convinced should be his when it was old enough to break. It was ordinary and beautiful, the kind of life Quinlan had never dared dream he might have. After the children were in bed, Clara and Quinlan sat on the porch together, watching the stars emerge. It was their favorite time of day, these quiet moments when the work was done and they could just be together without demands or interruptions. You ever miss it? Clara asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. The simplicity of being just a foreman, before all the responsibility of running this place fell on your shoulders. Never, Quinlan said without hesitation. Every gray hair, every sleepless night, every hard decision, it's all worth it because I'm living this life with you. I'd take complicated and challenging with you over simple and easy with anyone else, every single time. She turned her face up to his, and in the starlight, her eyes were luminous. I love you, Quinlan Yates, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and thought about all the years they had ahead of them. There would be more challenges, more hard winters and dry summers, more cattle to raise and children to guide into adulthood. But they'd face it all together, the way they'd faced everything since that day on the windmill when he'd handed her his wrench, and she'd accepted his help. The years continued to roll by like the seasons, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. When William was 10, he broke his arm falling from a horse, and Quinlan taught him how to get back in the saddle despite his fear. When Margaret was 8, she found an orphaned calf and raised it by hand, and Clara helped her understand the balance between compassion and the practical realities of ranch life. The ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. They weathered a terrible drought in the summer of 1895, losing some cattle, but saving the core of their herd through careful water management, and the network of windmills they'd installed across their property. They survived a brutal winter in 1899 when snow drifted higher than the fence posts, and they had to dig pathways to the barns every morning. Through it all, Clara and Quinlan's love deepened and matured. They learned the comfortable rhythms of long marriage, the way couples develop their own language of looks and gestures. They had arguments, of course, because they were both stubborn and passionate people with strong opinions. But they'd learned early on to never let the sun set on their anger, to talk things through no matter how difficult the conversation might be. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Quinlan took Clara back to the windmill. It was winter, and snow dusted the ground, but the sky was clear and blue as glass. They climbed the ladder together, their breath puffing white in the cold air, and stood on the platform looking out at the land they'd built their lives on. "I've been thinking about that day," Quinlan said, pulling Clara close against the cold. "The day I handed you my wrench and you actually took it. I think about how close I came to not climbing that ladder at all, to just letting you struggle through alone because I was afraid of overstepping or presuming too much." "I'm glad you climbed it," Clara said softly. "I needed your help that day, even though I didn't want to admit it. And I've needed you every day since." "Same here," Quinlan said. "Clara, you saved me. Before you, I was just going through the motions, working hard because I didn't know what else to do. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to be better than I thought I could be." She turned in his arms to face him, her gloved hands coming up to cup his face. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what love is, I think. Not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing to face life together, making each other stronger in the process." He kissed her then, there on the windmill platform where their story had really begun, and it felt like coming full circle. Below them, the ranch stretched out in all directions, the evidence of everything they'd built together. Beyond the ranch buildings, they could see their children playing in the snow, William showing Margaret how to build a snow fort the way Quinlan had taught him. "We did good," Clara said, watching their children. "With the ranch, with them, with us. We did really good." "We're not done yet," Quinlan reminded her. "We've got a lot of years ahead of us still." "Good," Clara said, smiling up at him. "I'm not tired of you yet." He laughed and kissed her again, and they stood there for a long time. Two people who'd found each other against the odds and built something lasting and true. As the years continued to pass, William grew into a fine young man with his mother's business sense and his father's way with horses. At 18, he was already being groomed to take over the ranch someday, though both Clara and Quinlan were in no hurry to hand over the reins. Margaret developed a love for veterinary medicine. Reading every book on animal husbandry she could get her hands, and often riding out with the local veterinarian when he came to treat ranch animals. By the time they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, Clara and Quinlan were considered pillars of the community. They'd hosted countless dinners, sponsored scholarships for ranch hands' children who wanted to attend school, and quietly helped families who'd fallen on hard times. The Riston Ranch, now officially known as the Quinlan Yates Ranch after Clara had insisted on adding Quinlan's name to the deed, was one of the most successful operations in Utah. But more important than the success was the love that had built it. Every morning, Quinlan and Clara woke up together in the bedroom that had once been hers alone. Every evening they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Every day, in 1,000 small ways, they chose each other again and again. One spring morning, when Clara was 42 and Quinlan was 45, they rode out together to check on a herd in the far pasture. It was the kind of perfect spring day that made you glad to be alive, with wildflowers dotting the grass and the sky an endless blue overhead. "Do you remember what I said that first night after we'd recovered the cattle?" Clara asked as they rode side by side. "About taking things one day at a time." "I remember," Quinlan said. "I think we've had some pretty good days," Clara said, and her smile was radiant. "The best days," Quinlan agreed. though I have a feeling there are still more ahead of us. They found the herd healthy and content, the calves frolicking in the spring grass while their mothers grazed peacefully. As Clara and Quinlan sat their horses side by side, watching the cattle that represented their livelihood and their legacy, a sense of profound contentment settled over them both. "I want you to know something," Clara said suddenly, "in case I don't say it enough. You are the love of my life, Quinlan Yates. Not my first love, but my truest love. The one that matters. The one that will last beyond all the years we have and into whatever comes after." Quinlan's throat went tight with emotion. "I love you too, Clara, more than words can say. You're my heart, my home, my reason for everything." They leaned across the space between their horses to kiss, the gesture as natural and necessary as breathing after all these years. The children grew and eventually began their own journeys into adulthood. William married at 22, a strong-willed young woman named Elizabeth who fit perfectly into the ranch family. They had their first child, a daughter, when William was 24, making Clara and Quinlan grandparents for the first time. Holding that tiny baby in his arms, Quinlan marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. From lonely ranch hand to grandfather, all because he'd climbed a ladder and handed Clara Rose his wrench. Margaret became one of the first female veterinarians in Utah, breaking barriers with the same stubborn determination her mother had always shown. She eventually married a doctor she met while studying in Salt Lake City, and though she moved away from the ranch, she visited often and never forgot where she came from. Clara and Quinlan continued to run the ranch well into their 60s, finally beginning to hand over more and more responsibility to William and his family. They never fully retired, because ranching wasn't the kind of work you could just walk away from, but they did slow down, spending more time with their grandchildren and less time in the saddle from dawn to dusk. On a summer evening in 1923, when Clara was 62 and Quinlan was 65, they walked out to the original windmill together. It had been repaired and rebuilt countless times over the decades, but the basic structure was still the same. They climbed the ladder together, moving slower than they once had but still steady, and stood on the platform as the sun set behind the mountains. 42 years, Clara said, leaning against Quinlan's side. "Since the day you handed me your wrench and I was smart enough to take it." "Best decision I ever made," Quinlan said, his arm around her shoulders. "Climbing that ladder, offering to help you, telling you how I felt. All of it." "Best decision I ever made was saying yes," Clara replied. "To the wrench, to your help, to your love, to everything." Below them, the ranch was alive with activity even in the evening light. Grandchildren played in the yard. William and Elizabeth worked in the barn, preparing for the next day. The windmill's blades turned steadily, pumping water to keep the cattle healthy and the ranch thriving. "We built something that will last," Quinlan said, looking out at the vista before them. "Not just the ranch, but a family, a legacy, something bigger than either of us alone could have created." "We did," Clara agreed. "Together, the way everything worth doing should be done." They stood there as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they'd watched together for more than 4 decades. And though their hair was gray and their faces lined with the passage of time, the love between them was as strong as it had ever been. Stronger, maybe, forged in the fires of shared challenges and tempered by years of choosing each other, day after day, through good times and hard. Eventually, they climbed down and walked hand in hand back to the house, the home they'd filled with love and laughter and the 1,000 small moments that made up a life well lived. Behind them, the windmill continued to turn, a monument to the day 2 people had met at the height of its platform and discovered that sometimes the best things in life come from accepting help, from taking a wrench when it's offered, from climbing a ladder even when you're not sure what you'll find at the top. Years continued to pass, gentle and inevitable as the changing seasons. Clara and Quinlan grew older together, their love a constant through the inevitable changes that time brought. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, welcomed more grandchildren into the world, and eventually, great-grandchildren. The ranch continued to thrive under William's management, but everyone knew the foundation had been laid by Clara and Quinlan, by their vision and hard work and unwavering commitment to each other and the land. When Quinlan was 78 and Clara was 75, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a party that brought family and friends from across the state. The barn was decorated with flowers and ribbons, and there was music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. But the best moment of the evening came when Clara and Quinlan danced together, moving slowly to a waltz that the musicians played just for them. 50 years, Clara murmured against Quinlan's chest. It went so fast. And yet every day felt full, Quinlan replied. No regrets, Clara, not a single one. No regrets, she agreed. Only gratitude for every day I got to spend with you. They danced until the song ended, and when they parted, there wasn't a dry eye in the barn. Their love story had become legendary in the community, a testament to what was possible when two people committed to facing life as partners. Quinlan passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Clara by his side until the very end. She held his hand as his breathing slowed and finally stopped, and though tears streamed down her face, she was grateful that he'd gone without pain, surrounded by the love that had defined their life together. Clara lived another 5 years after Quinlan's death, never remarrying because, as she told anyone who asked, she'd already had the great love of her life and didn't need another. She spent those years being a grandmother and great-grandmother, passing on stories about the ranch's history, about her father's vision and her mother's strength, about the day a foreman had climbed a windmill tower and handed her his wrench, changing both their lives forever. On a spring morning when she was 80, Clara asked William to take her out to the windmill one last time. He helped her into the saddle, worried about her frailty but understanding her need. They rode slowly out to the windmill, and though Clara couldn't climb the ladder anymore, she stood at its base with her hand on the weathered wood and looked up at the platform where her love story had begun. "He's waiting for me," she said to William, and her voice was content. "I can feel it. Somewhere beyond all this, he's waiting, and we'll have forever to keep building the life we started here." William had tears in his eyes. "I love you, Mother. Thank you for everything you and Father built, for the example you set, for showing us all what true partnership looks like." "Love each other," Clara said, turning to look at her son. "That's the secret, William. Love each other through the hard times and the easy ones, be partners in every sense of the word, and never forget that the best things in life come from working together. Your father taught me that, and I've never forgotten it." Clara Rose Yates died peacefully in her sleep 2 nights later, and the community mourned the loss of a woman who had been a pioneer in every sense of the word. She was buried beside Quinlan on a hill overlooking the ranch, and the entire county seemed to turn out for the funeral. But the story didn't end there, because the legacy Clara and Quinlan built continued on through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The Reston Yates Ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together, loved fiercely, and never gave up on each other or the land they'd pledged to protect. And on that ranch, the windmill still stood, repaired and rebuilt countless times but always in the same place, its blades turning steadily in the Utah wind. It became a symbol for the family, a reminder of where it all began, Of the day, a foreman had watched the boss's widowed daughter fix a windmill and had offered her his wrench. That simple gesture of help, accepted with grace despite pride, had sparked a love that lasted 50 years and built a legacy that would last forever. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was just right, ranch hands swore they could see two figures standing on the windmill platform, their arms around each other, looking out over the land they'd loved and protected. Whether it was just shadows or something more, no one could say for certain. But everyone agreed that if any love was strong enough to transcend death and time, it was the love between Clara Rose and Quinlan Yates, forged in hard work and tested by time, enduring as the land itself. The ranch continued to prosper into the next century, adapting to new technologies and changing times, but never forgetting its roots. In the main house, now occupied by William's youngest son and his family, there was a photo on the mantel of Clara and Quinlan on their wedding day, young and hopeful and so clearly in love it made everyone who saw it smile. Beside it was another photo, taken on their 50th anniversary, showing them older but still holding hands, still looking at each other with the same devotion that had carried them through 5 decades together. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed and the cattle calved, and the ranch came alive with new life, someone from the family would ride out to the windmill and stand at its base, remembering the story of how it all began. They'd tell their children and grandchildren about Clara's stubbornness and Quinlan's kindness, about how he'd climbed that ladder and she'd accepted his help, about how that single moment had changed the course of their entire family's history. Because that's what love does. It changes things. It builds things. It creates legacies that outlast the people who started them. And in a harsh land where survival often depended on strength and determination, Clara and Quinlan had proven that the greatest strength of all was the strength that came from two people choosing to face life together, as partners, as equals, as two halves of one whole. The windmill stood as their monument, turning steadily in the wind, pumping life, giving water to the land they'd loved. And in its shadow, generations grew and thrived, all of them touched by the love story that had started there so many years ago, all of them carrying forward the lessons Clara and Quinlan had taught through their example. That love was worth fighting for. That partnership meant true equality. That accepting help wasn't weakness but wisdom. That the best things in life were built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of kindness and faith at a time. And so the story ended where it began, at a windmill in the Utah desert, where a foreman once watched the boss's widowed daughter struggle with a broken gear and made the choice to climb a ladder and offer his help. Where she made the choice to accept it, and to accept him, and to build a life that would echo through the generations. Where two people found each other against the odds and proved that true love, the kind that lasts, is built not in grand gestures but in the 1,000 small choices to show up, to help, to stand beside each other through whatever life brings. The windmill turned and the land endured, and the story of Clara Rose and Quinlan Yates lived on, a testament to the power of love, partnership, and the courage to accept help when it's offered, knowing that sometimes the smallest gestures lead to the greatest adventures, and the simplest acts of kindness can change the course of a life, a family, and a legacy that will last forever.